Is a brief recap of what we have done in Premiere Pro for VR editing. As you recall, we have added the toggle VR display to our toolbar here. We did that just by clicking on the plus and adding this to our toolbar and hitting OK. So these are already in place. We're going to double click our bin to open our media, and we're going to find our encoded media that came from the Adobe Media Encoder. Remember, it has to have an _1, otherwise it's not the right file type. We're going to select import to import that into our bin. So as you can see, if you double click each one of these, they will show up in the equirectangular format unless we toggle that to our spherical display format. But we're going to leave it as equirectangular. Each of these videos, as you can see, has been correctly set up in 3840 by 1920 on the camera. So that's how it inputted into our sequence. So the way this works, you're going to just select an endpoint by clicking the letter I to make a starting point I, and then you're going to decide where you want to cut, and you're going to make an O for an out point, and you're going to just drag that into your sequence. Because this video is correctly formatted, now your sequence has been correctly formatted as well. And you can see that's the first video in our sequence or our movie. We can continue on doing this with the next video. Again, input or endpoint, out point, and then dragging. Now if you want just the video, you can, for instance, input endpoint here, out point here. And if I wanted just a video, I could drag just the video file in, and notice the audio does not come along. Or I can hold the Option key down, and that'll allow me to select individual objects and delete, in essence, the audio right here. And as you can see now, we've got 1, 2, 3 clips all in a row. So the next thing we might want to do is add, let's zoom in a little bit here, so we can see our first transition. You can see this is a straight cut. Spacebar to start playing. Notice how that cuts directly here. So what we might want to do is add a transition, and so we can go to our effects, which are located as one of our tabs, and we're going to just type VR so we can see only the virtual reality effects. And we're going to go to one of our wipes, for instance the gradient wipe. We're going to drag that, and notice how you can drag it on the edge, in the middle, or on the other edge. If you put it in the middle, it'll dissolve from one thing to the other, so be careful how this goes, left, right, or middle. I'm going to put it in the middle, and then I'm going to click on it, put my playhead over it, and you can kind of see what this wipe is going to do. It's going to do some weird kind of gradient type of wiping. Now you can increase the amount for it. I'm going to hit the plus button to zoom in. You can increase the length of this wipe just by grabbing the edges, just like you do with editing, and that'll make it a longer transition between the two clips. You can also select, put your playhead over the wipe here, select the wipe, and then go to the effects, and this will give you more effects choices here. You can do an alignment at center, at the start, at the, you can create, you can do a feather, increase the amount of feathering, or make it a little less sharp. So there's some opportunities to make that transition exactly what you'd like it to be. I'm going to zoom back out here, hit the minus button a couple times. So, and that's how a cut works. Now, remember when you have a cut, like for instance the iris wipe cut, and we're just going to select that by just going over it and making it a little longer than 1 second. Let's make it 3 seconds. You can see that's a longer transition. And you can see up here, what it's doing is it's making an iris in the middle, in other words a circle, and then it'll bloom out to form a circle all the way on the outside. So if you wanted to see what this looks like from the front, it would look like this, and then from the back you have the circle kind of like, it's like you're going through some type of warp, time warp or something. So I'm going to go back off a toggle so we can see it again. So here's our circle here. Obviously you can change your feather again to make it a hard circle or a little more soft, the way we had it before. Undo. Another thing you might want to do is change the center. Perhaps you don't want to be staring at this, but you would like the gentleman here in the center. So by selecting that clip and adding rotate sphere to the clip, this will allow you in the effects tab to change the Y and pan it so that it's in the middle, so that now when you see the effect, you'll see that that person is actually the first thing that we see in the middle that comes in. And if we can even make that a little bit more centered, and there it is. So that way, when you get into that clip, the center of interest or the point of interest is right in the center of the goggles. You can do that with all the clips too, just by adding that effect and dragging it onto those clips. Another possibility is, or any of these things like blur, you can do a nice blur. Again, I put it on, nothing seems to happen, but that's because we haven't actually increased the amount of blurriness here, and you can kind of see if we blur it up, it can be very, very blurry. And we can lower it down right here too. And remember, these are all keyframeable things. So for instance, if I wanted to start very blurry, maybe at like 96, I can click the stopwatch to start an animation in point, the start point. Then I can move the playhead a little bit in and say I would like it to be very sharp here. To go from blurry to sharp, all I do is now I lower the blurriness back to 0. And because I made a blurriness of like almost 100 here and 0 here, you can kind of see, or 96 going to 0, when I hit the space bar, you'll see it slowly come into focus. You can kind of see that right there. So again, animate any element that has a stopwatch in front of it, opacity, motion, rotation, etc. Okay. Another possibility is to work with a piece of Photoshop footage on top of it, like in order to add text or some other element. So I'm going to bring something in that I created in Photoshop. I'm going to let go, and you can see it's just my name here, Chris, and I put it on top, and so it floats on top of this clip. I can expand that so it's like over all 3 clips, right? But I'd like this to be, I'd like this word, Chris, to be maybe near the bottom perhaps, and not here. Now obviously I'm on the move tool here, and I can physically just grab that and move it down here, but when we see that in VR, we know that that's going to look very distorted, as you can kind of see here. So that's not what you want to do. I'm going to undo that a couple times and go back to the equal rectangular format. And what I'm going to do instead is add our effect. Where is it? There it is. Plane to sphere. So we're going to take a plane, a flat object like my Photoshop file, and put it on our sphere. And I'm just going to drag that and put it on top. And then I'm going to select that. So notice how if I'm not selecting it, it doesn't show up in our viewer. So select it. Go to the effects control, and now it allows me to actually rotate the projection. That's the important one. If you rotate the source, what's going to happen is it's just going to rotate this physical object. We'll go ahead and do that. I'll show you what that does. It like tilts it. You see how it rotates on like an axis there? I'm going to scale here, by the way, and not scale in up here in our motion tab. Although we have a scale here, this scale is going to deform it. Use the plane to sphere scaling so that we can make it larger or smaller. But you can kind of see I can make it larger, and if I did rotate the source, it would just flip it upside down. It's like it's rotating it. And so I don't want that. I'm going to put that back at 0. What I'd like to do is rotate the projection, and that allows me to move it like to the bottom, which is where I wanted it, or to the top, or you can move it to the bottom and then pan it over to wherever you'd like it. So like for instance, if I wanted it to be a little smaller, and this is where I'd like it, at the bottom, and when we go into our VR projection, you can see now it looks normal, just like we're hoping it does, right? Great. So some of the final things that we're going to do with our project is we're going to adjust the color and then export what we've gotten. So I'm just going to remind you that we're going to go into our color tab. So up here, we're currently in our editing tab, but if we click color, that's going to put us in a color workspace where we have access to some of the color correction tools more easily. Again, the editing workspace is great for editing, and then the color workspace is great for color correction. So remember the way this works. If you select a clip, I'm going to put my playhead over the clip so you can kind of see. Let's go back to our eco-rectangular view. If I were to adjust any of these sliders, because I've selected the clip, it'll adjust that clip. So this clip is the video which has this image, and so by lowering or increasing the exposure, I'm able to brighten just that clip. Obviously, just that clip gets the exposure boost. So when you go to the next clip, that is a completely different clip, and it doesn't get notice the exposure goes back to 0. So be careful about what clip is being selected when you're moving these these dials around. Now, if you wanted to give everything like an overall look, for instance, black and white, my suggestion would be to add something called an adjustment layer. And so let's go ahead and create an adjustment layer, and that's new object file. I go to adjustment layer and I hit OK, and what I'm going to get is a new file called adjustment layer. And the way this works, just make this big again so you can see it, is that you'll take this adjustment layer and you'll put it on top of everything. So it's kind of an invisible layer, but it will hold whatever adjustments you make to it. So instead of selecting this clip, and you notice the exposure is at 3.5, I'll just put that back in 0. I'm going to select the adjustment layer and put the exposure at 3.5, and you notice it looks the same, well, or at least 5 here, but 3.5, whatever. It looks the same as it was before, but now if I go to the next clip, it also has that exposure at 3.5, and this clip also has that exposure at 3.5. In fact, everything below this adjustment layer, just like in Photoshop, gets the adjustment. So for instance, if I wanted to make everything black and white, we can just easily do that just by lowering the saturation to 0. Let's see right here. If I just drag that down, you notice now my entire video is black and white. And that's just because the adjustment layer has that adjustment. You can check this. You can turn the eyeball on and off to see how it looks before and after, just like in Photoshop. So finally, after you've got the color adjusted for everything, maybe you want to put a fade out at the end or some text at the beginning. Whatever you'd like, it's time to then finally go to File, Export, Media. And what you're going to do is you're going to export the media. Here is the dialog that you're going to get. And you'll see right away that it's match source, high bitrate. What you'll want to do is make sure H.264 is selected, but in this case, we'll want to do VR monoscopic match source stereo, because we were working with stereo for this file, not ambisonic. We'll be doing that soon. I want you to also notice, I'm going to just open this up so you can see that if you click on the video tab and scroll all the way down, you're going to have this little checkbox, VR, video is VR. This is really important because otherwise, if that's not checked, then YouTube will not know that that is a VR video, and you won't see the 360 little selector when you're viewing this with your VR goggles. If everything looks good, you can do a little preview here. It'll test to make sure everything is the way you want it. You can then select export, and it'll export this video to this output name right here to the location you chose. Now, in this case, you might not have noticed where it was. So again, you can click on output name beforehand if you want to just be sure. Name this something else like final video. And pick 4, hit save. Now it will put it, as we saw, on the desktop as final video. And now we can hit export.